Okay, so as you know at this point, you've already, thought about this stuff for your projects, and we talked about a little bit in a synchronous session, but question writing is a really key part of survey research or any research that's involving self-report or interview type questions. And there are a couple steps that you need to engage in to write good questions. Some of them might seem a little obvious to the point that it's silly, but sometimes people don't necessarily think about these before they start, like just kind of writing things. So the absolute first step for question writing in a survey is to decide what information you're seeking. It's really essential to plan this stuff out from the get-go rather than just starting to throw words up there. If you decide what information you're seeking, you can find out if there are ways that people have assessed that stuff before, use them, think about writing your own questions. It's just an important first step. Once you know what information you're seeking, then you need to decide what types of questions to use. And we've talked a little bit at this point about this process, but I still want to review some of these ideas and talk a little bit more about some of the question types that we have. So we talked previously about the difference between closed-ended and open-ended questions. Closed-ended questions are ones where the researchers or question writers are completely prescribing the number of responses that you have. You are, given answers that you could use like just yes or no, agree or disagree, forcing between different alternatives. It might be a multiple choice type of question like maybe a survey about your education or racial or ethnic identification, something like that. Or you might have different types of rating scales or some kind of nonverbal measures where you only can point to something or circle or click something rather than just kind of free associating your answer. The other side of it, obviously, is open-ended questions that you can just ask people a question and give them space to either talk about or write about or type up their answer. Um, Open-ended questions, there are concerns that they are more difficult for people, and there might be certain biases that influence the types of things that people are likely to say in an open-ended question that might differ a bit from a closed-ended question. Another kind of inherent problem with open-ended questions is that it doesn't always lend itself as well to really clean analyses as closed-ended questions. With closed-ended questions, you know the range of responses, and you can set the questions up in a way that allow you to do particular statistical analyses. Open-ended questions are going to require extra work. They're going to require some type of coding scheme where people might have to, or people will have to read through those responses and have some training about how to identify what those responses mean and kind of convert those raw pieces of writing that people are doing into some kind of numbers, some maybe a count or like an extremity or something like that. Um, this type of process has, in more recent years, been partly automated. There are different, word and language analysis softwares. There's a really popular one by a researcher named Jamie Pennebaker, University of Texas at Austin. It's called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, LIWC, and they decided to phonetically pronounce that Luke, which I always kind of have to think twice about how to say it because it doesn't look like Luke, obviously. But that's a very popular way to not only analyze like the length of something, but look at its content. They have dictionaries that Luke has within it that can code for like aggression or anger or happiness or the use of different types of pronouns or anything like that. So there are ways to automate that process too, but it's still in some ways going to require more work than a relatively straightforward closed-ended question. I said there were some concerns about open-ended questions, and we'll talk about these in turn, but they might be, not as big of a deal necessarily as people used to think. So there were lots of concerns in the 70s and 80s that asking people open-ended questions was too difficult for less educated or less articulate or intelligent respondents. That trying to think of answers to questions is just not equally possible for different people in different educational levels. Um, This doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. If people are going to take the time to read and respond to a question, they're generally not going to have that much of a problem with it. But respondents that are less interested, which frequently is going to include respondents that are less educated, those types of respondents are going to skip open-ended questions more often because they are more challenging. They are more time consuming. They're not necessarily too challenging for less educated people, but they might be just less likely to answer them. There are also concerns that open-ended questions are influenced by something called salience bias. This is just the idea that when something gets higher media coverage, it's going to be more accessible and more top of mind for people when they're answering something. Now, this seems to not be the case, but I will caution you that the fact that closed and open-ended questions don't tend to see huge differences in their, for example, there are commonly questions on political surveys like, what is the most important issue facing the country right now? And you might think that that would be affected by news coverage, but the research that we have on this says that it really doesn't affect things that much. However, um, and if you look at people's TV consumption rates, that doesn't moderate the effect. So people that watch tons of TV don't like differ in the things that they're saying from people that watch less TV. However, like I said, this is perhaps an outdated finding. In the last 15 to 20 years, the media environment, particularly in the United States, with the rise of the internet and really siloed partisan types of media, has changed dramatically. It did not used to be the case that, people on the left or the right of the political spectrum had like their own news, right? Everyone used to watch all of the same 3 or 4 channels and get the same messaging. Now that there are self-selected media bubbles, there needs to be a lot more research about this salience bias, because you can imagine, people that watch Fox News, for example, that are, more conservative, they are just not going to see a lot of the negative things about people on the right, for example, because Fox News is going to choose not to tell them those things. This happens on the left too, but Fox News really kind of pioneered this strategy of only giving people kind of the news that they is filtered through their partisan bubble. So as far as we knew in the 80s and 90s, this was not a problem, but I would be very surprised if it was not at least some of a problem today. Open-ended questions might also be difficult because they, don't really provide a frame of reference. If you ask people what's the most important issue facing the country, people might say an election or a pandemic, or they might say something a lot more specific. And it's really difficult to tell like what exactly people are thinking of when they think of what's the most important issue. However, even though this is probably a problem with open-ended questions, closed-ended questions are problematic in a different way, that they probably provide too much of a frame of reference. And people feel like they need to pick, let's stick with the important issue question, they need to pick something from that list, and they might be less likely to think on their own because they're just using the framing from the questions. So yes, frame of reference is likely a problem for open-ended questions, but it's also just a different sort of problem for closed-ended questions. And if you use both types, then you can hopefully try to cancel out those biases by having people respond to both, kind of using those answers to complement one another, and then even counterbalancing the order of open and closed questions to make sure that they're not affecting each other, basically. So for closed-ended questions, which are more common and frequently easier to use, I think people don't always necessarily think carefully enough about how they are going to label scales that they use. So I'm talking about just your standard scale that's like, hey, how much do you agree with this statement? 1 is agree, 7 is disagree, or something like that, right? So how should we make these types of scales? Well, there's a lot of research in political science about this and other areas too, but it's most common there. And that research tells us that it's best to use words to describe what the scale points mean, because people kind of interpret those numbers differently. In addition, the words that you're using don't they're not necessarily an interval scale, right? The way that you describe scale points does not necessarily have perfectly even amounts of space between those scale points. And if you use numbers on scales that are intervals, right? 1 to 2 is the same as 2 to 3. Um, People might get the false impression that those scales are interval, which kind of causes a problem in how people interpret them. But using words and leaving off numbers seems to be the best practice. Like I said, with this kind of interval problem, you want to try your absolute best to make a numbered, or not numbered, but a multiple point scale seem like it's equal. Respondents, like I said, expect this, that, there's going to be equivalent space between like the 1 and 3 answer as there is between the 3 and 5 answer, right? So this can sometimes be difficult um, to make sure that your wording conveys that, partly because people interpret different words differently. But you don't want to like mix the type of modifiers that you're using. You don't want to, make the points seem too close together. It's good to have like on the ends options that say like, something like extremely or very, so people can show like a passionate response and then show like less certain responses as they get toward the middle of a scale. One thing that I see doesn't happen nearly as much as it should is people don't label every point of their scale, which they absolutely should. When you see a scale that's just from agree to disagree, different people are going to interpret that ambiguous scale very differently. Some people that are going to say, like, let's say 1 that is labeled agree, some people are going to pick agree just because they like simply agree with it. Other people are going to pick agree in that scenario because it's the most extreme point on the agreement end of the scale. But those people might be saying different things by choosing that same scale point there, basically. So if you label every point, participants can interpret things a little more consistently and have fewer problems with it, and it makes the scales more reliable, meaning more consistent, and more valid, meaning more assessing the thing that we want to assess. I already said this, but if you're labeling things, when you're labeling things, don't mix modifiers. So, for example, we use different wording to talk about certainty and amount. So if you have a scale that says like definitely agree to not agree at all, that's going to be kind of problematic for people to interpret because certainty and amounts are not the same thing. Now, not everyone is going to notice that and care about that, but it might be confusing and add some kind of systematic biases into your survey. The number of scale points you use also seems to matter. If you're using less than 5, then people might sometimes feel like they can't really express exactly how they feel, like in a level of agreement for something. And if you're using more than 7, then there doesn't seem to be any meaningful increase in people's variability, and it just makes it harder to interpret scales. So a lot of the research we have tells us that having somewhere between 5 and 7 points is the sweet spot in how to write scales for surveys. What you might also consider doing is to have an even number of scale points if you think that people are going to, pick the middle all the time. People do have a tendency when they're unsure or feeling lazy, and we'll talk about that stuff in the next section of this unit. But they might be likely to pick 4 on a 1 to 7 scale because it like sort of absolves them of picking a side, and that can lead to people, not giving you the information that you really need. So if you use 6, which falls in that 5 to 7 range, there is no middle point for 6, and you force people to choose one side or the other. And this is good because it's going to reduce that number of people that are kind of opting out and just picking 4. However, there are some people who really don't have an opinion about something. And if you force them to either be on one side or the other, then sometimes that's going to reduce the validity of your scale because those people don't have an answer that applies to them. So again, like everything, there's a trade-off here when you choose the number of scale points, whether it's even or odd. Another option that I want to mention is a way to kind of break questions down into pieces. So when you have one of those Likert scales, there is a criticism of that range of like, let's stick with 1 to 7. Um, that's that's making people make more than one judgment at a time. So you not only have to say like, well, okay, do I agree or disagree? Okay, I agree. How much do I agree? And that's really asking two questions at once, and it makes it more difficult for people to rightfully interpret what they actually think. Let me use an example for partisanship. A very common way to kind of break this question down is to, instead of asking people to put them on a scale from Democrat to Republican, you might first ask them, are you a Republican, Democrat, Independent, or what? Once they tell you that, you ask the Republicans, do you think you're a strong or a weak Republican? You ask the Democrats, do you think you're a strong or weak Democrat? And you ask those people in the middle, well, okay, we know you're independent or moderate, but do you consider yourself closer to the Democratic or Republican Party, or neither? And that kind of takes a lot of those people that would have been in the middle, and it gives them the chance to say, well, yeah, I do kind of lean one way. So you end up creating a scale that's the same in its points as you would have if you just asked people a 1 to 7 question, but you've broken it down in a way that allows them to really reflect more carefully on what they actually think. So all those Republicans, you break them down into the strong and weak Republicans, all the Democrats, weak and strong Democrats, and then all these people in the middle, if they said in the first question they're independent or not affiliated, they then have the chance to say, well, yeah, I do lean this way or I do lean that way. And that breaks up all the people that would have just put 4 on here, not necessarily correctly. And we know from lots of political science and psychology research that these people that lean one way or another act much more like partisans than they do true independents or unaffiliated people. And you can do this with your questions in your study too. You don't obviously have to study partisanship to do this. You can ask people, hey, do you agree with this or not? And then follow up and ask them, well, okay, how much do you agree or disagree with this? And that might give them a more systematic way of thinking about their answering. So deciding what question types has a lot of thinking and information that goes into it. Once you've decided what to use, you definitely should also write drafts of your questions. You shouldn't just assume that the first way you write it, just like you wouldn't with a paper that you're writing, you're not going to get the wording perfect the first time. You need to think about it, edit it, get feedback from people. You need to re-examine those things that you've written and make sure that they are going to be interpretable by your sample and are really assessing exactly what you want to. It might be that you wrote a question that doesn't actually assess the variable that you're interested in, and having feedback and somebody pointing that out to you would of course be very useful. It's also good to do like pilot testing or pre-testing to make sure that the questions are interpretable to people, but that's going to be something that's going to take time and resources and money. So it's not always possible, but if you can pilot test things, especially manipulations, that's going to be a good idea. Finally, you need to edit your survey and also think about procedures and instructions and how people are going to be responding to this, because that might influence things about their answers. So you think about question writing as kind of a straightforward, well, hey, I'm just going to write some words and have people tell me what they think. And there tends to be a lot more to it than that. And you need to make sure that you're thinking about this in a systematic, iterative way rather than just kind of vomiting out some words that may or may not be interpretable to people. You also want to make sure you're very clear in how you're writing these questions and avoiding some of these things I mentioned in the synchronous class. Double-barreled questions might be something like, how important do you think it is that cars be safe and fuel efficient? Well, you're asking two questions. You're asking how important is it that cars are safe, and how important is it that cars are fuel efficient? And people might answer both of those things at once. They might just be thinking about one or the other, or they might be conflicted about their answer. Leading questions are ones that are going to like imply some kind of behavior on people. Like if you ask somebody, hey, what's the type of orange juice that you enjoy drinking the most? Like, well, maybe they don't drink orange juice, so it's going to be problematic for them to answer that question. Loaded questions, also very important, putting some kind of value or moral judgment in a question, like how much should concerned parents be careful about using car seats? Well, just ask people about car seats. You don't need to put this like weird thing about, hey, concerned parents, and people start thinking about that rather than the actual content of the question. You also generally want to avoid negative wording. It's hard for people to interpret, like, how much do I disagree with this negative statement, right? So wording things positively is useful, but you also do want to word things in opposite directions for some psychometric reasons. But I can talk about that in more detail with groups that might need some guidance there. We've also talked about, counterbalancing a little bit in previous areas, and it's important to think about how questions are going to affect one another. So the order really does matter. You might want to randomize the order of certain things that you think might influence one another. And you want to think carefully about how honest and truthful people are going to be, because people might not want to tell you how racist they are, or they might not want to tell you how many sexual partners they've had, right? They might react to your questions in a way they're like offended, or giving an extreme response because of how you ask the question, or lying because of the experience of being involved in an interview. So in the last part of the survey research lectures, I'm going to talk about something called satisficing, that has to do with how we interpret people's survey responses and try to encourage them to think carefully about them.